Perfect. Let's begin. So, just want to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Charles Beecroft, and today, as you can see from the screen, I will be discussing today on the topic on how internal auditing addresses your organizational compliance concerns. So, we're taking a step into the world of internal auditing, and in one of our times to learn a bit more of the subject and to get a bit more understanding of what actually entails and the requirements for that, especially from a compliance perspective. Just a couple of little admin bits before we start. There's about 186 of us on the call today, which is fantastic, a really nice turnout. If you do want to put any questions into the chat, you're more than welcome, but you need to put into the questions box there. There will be a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, and I answer questions through, but I will try and endeavor to answer the questions as we go through. It may mean me sort of checking between the slides and the actual questions, but I will try and answer questions as you go through. So please use those questions. If I don't get to you during the webinar, I assure you I will get to you afterwards. And I hope I'll be able to answer your questions. But again, if I don't know the answer, and I really want to find out, or say I'm 90 or 80% sure, I'll follow up with an email afterwards as well. So you'll definitely get the answer to your question. But perfect. So let's start off with the webinar. So what we were discussing today is that actually this webinar, just to provide a little bit of context here, is a more slimmed down or more sort of condensed version of a webinar that I delivered at the beginning of the year, sort of about the value of internal auditing. This is a bit more about focusing on compliance, compliance obligations, this is regulatory, legal, things like that as well. But ultimately, is most of the same stuff is from that webinar earlier. If you wish to watch that webinar for more of a detailed look, then you're more than welcome to check out the recording of that, either on YouTube on the NQA account for that, or on our NQA website. So check that out when you have the opportunity. But first of all, we'll go for the agenda for today. So first of all, we'll look at the ISO management systems as a whole. So just to cover the basics here that we're on the same page, we're looking specifically at the process model approach, the PDCA model, and of course the Annex SL high level structure. So quite standard sort of concepts there, but most people will be familiar with that. But please use it as an opportunity just to get a better understanding and so that have those foundations in place. Then we'll jump straight into what actually is internal auditing, the requirements for it, and I'll take you through that step-by-step approach in terms of what you need to start one off, what you need to do to begin one, and also what kind of things you need when you finish at the end. And then on the final section part of this point, we'll look at the benefits of internal auditing from a compliance perspective. So look at those benefits to your organization or to your business, as I mentioned before as well. Then we'll finish off with a Q&A to ask and grill me with any questions you may have for the webinar. But also, what I should have said this at the very beginning. So I want to make sure that everyone can hear me and see the slides. There should be a slide here for the agenda. And if you can't hear me for whatever reason or can't see the slides, please put that into the questions or in the chat. And then I have an understanding of what actually is whether people can actually see it or not. So if you can, brilliant. If you can't, just put it up there as well. And just to reiterate as well, this slide and the webinar as a whole, the actual webinar will be recorded, and the slides will actually be sent to all delegates after the webinar. So you'll have that in your own hands, hopefully, about an hour or so after the webinar completes. Perfect. So let's start off with just some basic things as we go through. We just want to introduce what NQA is. NQA, as you can see from the slide, is a world-leading certification body with global operations. And even though it specializes in the high technology and engineering sectors, we also do a variety of different sectors in the area as well. You can see from the slide as well, we're top 3 in the UK for the sort of the 4 major standards there, and also leading areas in both the automotive, telecommunications, and aerospace sectors worldwide. And if you go through a little bit by myself, so that you actually put like an actual name to a face, and I'm just a body, I'm just speaking about internal auditing. I'm recently the training manager for NQA, and that means I'm responsible for the growth of the training business and also managing the delivery of all training courses for NQA. Not only I have achieved my lead audit status in 9001 and 27001, I'm also an internal auditor in 14001 and 45. And in a time many years ago, I did complete my PhD at the University of East Anglia, if people know that well, in Norwich. And I've also taught extensively at the University College London, the London School of Economics, and of course, UEA. And in between all that, sandwiched nicely in between, I also spent 4 years at Pearson Education, where I was helping deliver postgraduate online education for thousands of students for 7 UK universities. Perfect. So that's a little bit of my bio, NQA, and done and dusted. But now we're going to look at the overview to the ISO management systems. And I think it's really important to start off with the process model approach, because this is really fundamental to putting yourself in the mind or the process, ideally, for to be to be an internal auditor. And you might have seen this before, but essentially what every business is, or every organization is, if you really boil it down, it comes to input, activity, output. You put things in, an input, you do things with them, that's the activity, and you produce a product or a service. But input, activity, output. And just keep this in mind, because ultimately when you're reviewing processes or putting yourself that sort of hat of internal auditing, you really need to understand how any process you see fits into an overall process model approach. And you can see from the bullet points there, you need to determine the processes of the managed system, identify those inputs and outputs, especially the expected outputs. What do you actually want to produce from all those inputs and activities? And within that, determine the sequence and interactions of how those interact with each other to produce a conforming product. But to achieve this, you have to have effective controls. And these controls are essential, almost one of the biggest parts of the management system, because ultimately you need to put things in place to ensure that you're producing the output that you intend to be. And the controls sort of steer you towards the right direction, because without those controls, then you're producing things or producing outputs that aren't conforming for whatever reason. So keep this in mind. So remember this later, and I'll be referencing this at the later part of the webinar. And so just keep that in mind. And of course, that final point, addressing any risks to that whole process or any opportunities to that entire process. Perfect. I'm just going to check, make sure that we have see any questions that come in. Perfect. I think I've one person from Alison who has left the call, said my sound's gone, which is not ideal. But hopefully people can still hear me. She has left the call, but hopefully everything's okay. If you still have issues hearing me, please write in the chat. But if you can, just put it into the chat as well. Just give me a bit of validation. It'll help enormously. Perfect as well. And we've got actually now 234 attendees, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. Perfect. So we'll continue on from the process model approach, and we'll go on to the plan, do, check, act cycle. So this is known as the PDCA cycle. People are pretty familiar with this ultimately as well, but ultimately it provides a nice little framework for organizations to follow that links in quite nicely with ISO management systems on how to ensure you get the best form of process in place for ensuring the managed system conforms as expected. So you can see here that plan, do, check, act. Now, if you start from the top, and you can start at any point in the cycle, which is why it is that cycle, the planning determines the goals for the process and needed change to achieve them. That do, that sort of clause 8, if you will, implements the changes. The check part, that performance evaluation, evaluates the results and in terms of performance of the management system. And finally, the act standardizes and stabilizes the change and also begins the cycle again, depending on the results. But you see here, the reason why it's a cycle, because you can start at any point in that process in order to start whatever is appropriate. But keep that in mind as you go through the presentation, that process model, plan, do, check, act, all essential components for conducting a really thorough internal audit. And then finally as well, the Annex XL high-level structure. This is pretty standard, of course, for the ISO management systems. If you're familiar with ISO, this is all very sort of easy to understand. But just as an overview, we have the 3 clauses there at the top, those 10 clauses in total, and this establishes the management system. And then you've got the main ones there, that 4 to 10, which aligns nearly all the ISO management systems as a whole. And then we will be focusing today on clause 9, performance evaluation, and clause 10, improvement. 9, as you can see here, is probably particularly important because of that clause 9.2, which is that check element of, course, the internal auditing, and clearly as well for clause 10, that improvement, 10.2, non-conformity and corrective actions, and that 10.3, that commitment to continual improvement. Those are really key parts to the internal auditing aspect, because ultimately clause 9 allows you to do that performance evaluation to check the management system in place is actually working, that checking element. And then once you see if it's actually working or it needs improvements, then you go to that sort of clause 10, the improvement element there. That 10.2, that non-conformity corrective actions, which we'll be going through in detail later in this presentation. Perfect. And the final point of this section, we'll look at processes and documented information. Now, any key part of any management system is emphasis on processes, whether it's organizational, supporting, operational, but most importantly, all these processes have to be documented information because it allows the management system to be monitored. This is a really key point stated in clause 7.5, which you can see here is that 7, that support clause over there. But 7.5 is essential for conducting internal audits because in itself, an internal audit is an example of documented information. And from a compliance perspective as well, there's loads of examples of relevant documents that are essential for this process that you have to keep record of. This includes regulatory requirements such as data privacy agreements, audit reports, as mentioned before, compliance manuals, risk assessments. And organizations need to ensure they are creating and updating these documents as appropriate. There are right versions of the available when needed, and they have versions of that. They are stored appropriately. They can be retrieved. The retain is appropriate as well. And these are incredible value to both the organization and, for the case of this webinar, internal audits themselves. Perfect. So understanding what is the internal auditing actually is. That is the next section we'll look at, but I'm just going to check the questions to see if any come through. But a couple of questions coming through. Yep, a lot of people said the sound works fine, which is great. So, which is all good. Thank you very much for all the help there as well and the validation. And for yes, just I think a couple of questions about the PowerPoint and on the recording. Just to be clear, as mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, a PowerPoint slides will be made available. You'll be sent that it'll be on the NQA website, but it'll be sent over to all the delegates and a recording of this webinar as well. So you'll have all that, so you can either zone out for the next hour and watch it at your own time, or you can engage. It's entirely up to you. You have all the choices there. So Richard, I hope that answers your question there about the PowerPoint. Perfect. So let's crack on with the next part of the webinar. Right, so understanding what audit is. So the best thing to do with these situations is to start off with the definition. So this is from ISO 14001, but to be clear, I'll read it out for those. An audit is defined as a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. So you can probably get a little sense of what that actually means, but if you go to the next slide, you can see the 3 different types of audit examples. So today's webinar, we focus on number 1, that first-party internal audits, or audits are carried out by an organization on their own systems. So you'll notice you might have an audit team, you might be part of an audit team, you might be individual, but you'll notice that they'll be probably separate within your organization, but separate, so they can conduct impartial, objective audits within the organization. Now, we won't look at second party today, but third party, just to give an example, is known as an external audit. And these are audits performed by an independent body, usually for certification purposes. So an example is where you might have an external auditor, which is from NQA, for example, and they might come to your business to provide an external review of your management system as a whole. But the first thing they'll ask, one of the first things they'll ask to see is that can we see your internal audit's results, the plans, and everything that as well, because that's where they will start and go and see, you've done your internal audit, you raised these things, but you resolved them. I want to just check that everything's okay for those things being raised. But do you see how that interlinks with each other, both with the internal auditing there and the external auditing as a whole? But they're both essential to each other. Now, objectives. Every internal audit or audit in general has to have objectives because you need to know what you want to achieve, right? The first most primary one is conformance to the standard. Now, this makes sense. If you have ISO 14001, 9001, you want to make sure that your management system adheres to the requirements of standard, whether it's clause 7, clause 4, it doesn't matter, but you have to have evidence to show that you're conforming. And that's what internal audit hopes to achieve to ensure that, right? They said this is what the standard says. Are they doing it? Yes, they are. Likewise as well, within that, you have to conform to your own management system. And now, like, for example, you may have a quality manual. That's not a requirement for the for 9001, for example, but if you have your own quality manual, the internal auditor says, right, well, we'll check that your management system and your manual has specific processes, and it says here in this document that you're doing X. Let's see that in reality. Is that actually happening? And that's where the internal auditor will be able to assess that and provide evidence whether it is conforming or not. Thirdly, as well, what you might see is actually the conformance to contractual requirements, obligations. And this is particularly important because you may have a contractual requirement, say with a supplier, for example, that you have to supply them X products or things in a certain amount of time. And the internal audit will assess really whether actually assess really where actually you're doing that or not. And if you are, fantastic. If you're not, there might be a concern there. So you need to understand that's where the internal audit will have that value, because not only are you doing to the standard to your own system, but to also contractual obligations, and also within that compliance obligations as well. And these include regulatory, this includes legal, this has been particularly relevant, say, for 14,001 for an environmental thing, 45,001 health and safety, all key parts to make sure that you're meeting those requirements. And if you're not, that can be seriously considered both a non-conformity or even something worse perhaps as well. Perfect. So audit preparation. So you know the objectives are for the audit, you know how that fits in. Now you need to prepare for that audit, whether you obviously are the auditor yourself and you need to make sure what you need to prepare, or the auditee, because you know actually what the auditor will expect of you, and you need to prepare accordingly and go have everything that they, when they ask, do you have this document, do you have this, you can prepare and give them to that and have everything, all your ducks in a row. And as you can see from the slide, we've already discussed quite a few of them as well. The compliance obligations, audit standard as mentioned before, the results of previous or external audits, the contractual obligations, and the manager's system. But one thing we haven't discussed is the audit scope. Now, people might be familiar with this already, and I apologize if I'm repeating this for some individuals, but so on the same page. An audit scope essentially is the actual boundaries of the audit. Now, you may make a decision as an organization that you, for whatever reason, want only one department, one section, one facility, one geographic location to be audited to this requirements. So a good example of this would be, say, if you had two facilities, one was your head office and one was a factory, but you wanted the factory to be certified to 45,001 for health and safety reasons, but you made a judgment that the head office doesn't for whatever reason because there's no need there. That's the audit scope, because you expect the internal audit for 45,001 only to take place in the factory, rather necessarily the head office. So but then if you went beyond that and tried to do 45,001 to the head office, that wouldn't actually be within scope. That what is known as scope creep. So it's important as an internal auditor that you understand actually what are the requirements here and what you need to be responsible for and what are you auditing against, both the auditor and the auditee. I've just seen a couple of questions come through. I'm just going to finish the end of these slides, and then I'll just take some questions when we come to that next section, if that's okay. So please bear with me, and we'll just continue through the rest of the presentation, or the rest of the section of the presentation. So in this particular one, now the slide, now this is the auditor activities. Now, some people might have experience actually undergoing an audit, they might experience actually conducting an audit, either way. But we'll start actually give a bit of a paint little picture in terms of what actually an audit entails, what are we actually doing on a day-to-day basis. So the auditor arrives in this particular case, or we'll have the meeting maybe booked out, and they'll usually conduct an opening meeting. And this sets the expectations for the entire day in terms of what will be covered, what will be expected of individuals involved, and you run through the audit plan in terms of so everyone is on the same page in terms of what will be done for that entire day. And then, as the auditor will do, they will follow the plan and they will ask questions and record answers. Because ultimately, to the plan, they will say they will have specific areas they want to look at and specific people they want to speak to and things they want to see. Because what they're doing from that interviewing and seeing, they're collecting evidence and they're using this evidence against the criteria. An example would be, say, if you're looking at, say, the operations, the clause 8 of a particular standard, you might say, okay, you said that your manual says you do X. X is what I want to see that in action as well. So can you take me to the part of the facility where you do that X, and you go and you observe that, and you observe that whether that activity is actually conforming as expected as per the document and actually playing a part in that input activity output process model or approach as intended, or is it not, and why is it not, and what evidence do you have to show that as well? And this can also take the form of interviewing individuals. You want to interview the facilities manager and say, it says here that you need to do X, Y, Z. Can you give an example of where that is? Or can you explain to me the process in some shape, way, or form? And if they're conforming, fantastic. If not, you want to dig deeper and ask more questions and take more evidence as well to ensure that you need to ensure that the management system is acting as it's supposed to be intended as well. And that's the key part there of that entire process. And once you take those notes and you collect the evidence as well. You prepare a presentation, a report, if you will, and you conduct the closing meeting where you present what has been found and your essentially outcomes from the actual audit day to the relevant individuals. Usually this is top management or management representatives of some kind, but this is where, example, you make it clear what actually was the outcomes from that audit file and whether what things are working or what things aren't for whatever reason. Perfect. So I'm just keep going through the slides now. This is a good example. So as I mentioned before, in terms of the different types of questions of recording answers and evidence, you might see this example as you might have your own ones if you've done audits in the past, but an audit checklist. And you can see here, this is an example of how you actually record information as you go through the entire process of the audit. So if you look at this slide here, you can see if you look at the actual table, you have questions to topic on the left-hand side, and this looks and speaks into the areas of topic or focus you want to focus on when you're looking around and exploring the facility. The reference is the clause number in this particular case. The response is what you did, what did you actually observe, what did you see, and the evidence is the evidence you've seen, actually whether it's conforming or not conforming or not. And as you can see here, there's a bit of text on the slide, but if you could just focus on the top line there, that overview waste processing, you can see here that the auditor in this case has said, oh, I want to look at overview waste processing. The reference number there is at 14,001 8.1. So I'm focusing on that clause there in detail. And if you look at the next slide, you can in that top row there, you can see the response. In this case, the auditor, in this case, I think C. Moore, has toured the waste storage areas and discussed with the waste manager. So he should detail what he has done. And in evidence he has found generally good housekeeping, which is great. So conforming there, minor littering and oil spills. So could be a bit of an issue there, and we'll explore that further. But you can see, for example, in terms of how that is laid out as well. So if you're an auditor, you can actually see how this is done as an example and how you lay this out information. But as an auditee, you actually then have to have an understanding in terms of what they're actually looking for and how that information is gathered and presented in their own notes when then you presented this, say, at the closing meeting. And you can even here use that compliance element as well. You can actually see here halfway through, you can see in my mouth, one of the lines here for 14,001 clause 6.1.3, it mentions in terms of evidence of hazardous or non-hazardous of waste disposal, and that doesn't meet statutory and regulatory requirements. In this case, what the response here is clear segregation in place for most areas. The procedure makes it clear, and there's appropriate signage for oil, wood, and plastic. And the evidence to demonstrate this is that chemical oil waste separated, which is great. General mixed recyclable skip, there's a wood skip, there's a plastic skip, and most importantly, all segregated waste is recycled. So again, so they raised the question, are regulatory requirements being met? And he has shown actually the clause that he wants to adhere to, he's shown his response and the evidence to show that the actual system is working. So it's conforming as expected, which is excellent. However, though, there may be situations where you might have to raise a non-conformity, and this happens, and it's simply because the managed system isn't working. And to use the definition from 9000, from the ISO 9000, a non-conformant is a non-fulfillment requirement, and the audit criteria is not met or not being fulfilled if it meets these four or one of these four elements. If the system does not comply with the standard, the management system, a contractual requirement, or regulatory requirement as well. So just keep this in mind when you're talking about non-conformities in terms of how do you actually grade non-conformity, because it's not meeting that requirement. But I think it's important as well at this stage to give a little bit of understanding in terms of what actually non-conformity and how this is defined, a bit more detail. Now, there are three sort of steps in this, and with like increasing level of severity. And you might be familiar with this. There's an opportunity for improvement, an OFI, a minor nonconformity, or major nonconformity. Now, I'll just make sure that I get the definition right for this in case as well. So, an OFI, or an opportunity for improvement, is an opportunity to refine the system. It may develop into a nonconformity, that's important, may develop, but it does not have to be acted upon if needed. See this as an opportunity, which is in the name, for you as an organization to go, right, the auditor has raised something here, the internal audit has raised something here that could be a concern, not yet a concern, but it could be if it's not acted upon. So there's a wonderful chance for yourselves, an organization, to go, right, we need to fix this before it becomes something more serious. So again, OFI may develop into a nonconformity, but does not. If we move into the definition of minor nonconformity, I just want to make this very clear, a minor nonconformity which does not affect the capability of the managed system to achieve its intended result. Notice here, does not affect the capability of the management system to achieve the intended result. So this, if we just go back a tad to the process model, notice how what it says here is that what's happening here, that there is something happening, so clearly something happening either with the input or the activity that's causing the minor nonconformity, but you're still producing an output which meets the requirements. So it's clearly an issue, but not that much of an issue just yet, where it's actually having that much of an impact, but it could have an impact. But just keep that in mind in terms of that minor major differential, because I think people get quite confused in terms of what actually is differential. It's clearly an issue, and I don't want to give examples there because it's quite contextual, but ultimately the difference between minor and major is that minor does not impact the ability to produce those output that conforms to the management system. So if we go back actually now to that one, I'm going to give you the definition of a major nonconformity. So there are two definitions here. So we'll start off with the second definition, which links into minor nonconformities. So a major nonconformity can also be given if a number of minor nonconformities associated with the same requirement or issue demonstrates a systemic failure. You notice the definition here as well, that a minor nonconformity by itself is considered a minor nonconformity. But if it's minor nonconformities in the same area, then that might be a source of concern as well, because actually ultimately, is there enough sufficient control there? Is there enough rigor and robustness in the system for that area to ensure that those areas are being weeded out? But they're not, because if they were, you wouldn't see so many. And this links in perfectly with the actual definition of a major nonconformity, because a major nonconformity should be classified as such if there is significant doubt. Now, significant doubt, that's the key phrase there, that effective process control is in place, or that products or services will meet the specified requirements. That's the key part there. The significant doubt that effective process control is in place. Because if there was effective process control, you wouldn't see those errors or those non-conforming products for whatever reason. So that's the element there. So the doubt is provided by the evidence raised, as mentioned before, say those from the oil spills, and also if it happens multiple times and multiple minor nonconformities, then that might constitute a major nonconformity. A lot to handle there. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and I'll tackle them at the next break. We're approaching that soon. I've seen a couple of questions come through, so I'll answer them in turn. But just to go on to this next point here, contents of nonconformity report. So what I really want to focus on first is not the diagram on the left, not the actual report, but on the actual diagram of nonconformity. To raise nonconformity, you need requirements, findings, and evidence. The requirement is the clause number from the standard, generally speaking. So that would be like 8.5.2 in this particular case. The findings is actually what has been observed, what is actually seen, actually what actually has been found there, and the evidence as is the evidence backing that up in terms of what you have found, and actually and the multiple evidence to show that actually the finding is correct. And we can see this as an example. So you hear the nonconformity report by this is the same one, obviously the same order as before, Seymour. He's used the standard reference there from 14,001, 8.5.2, which is the requirement. He is constituted as a minor nonconformity, as you can see. He is put down, not all waste held in stores is clearly identified. This is the finding. And then what he's done for the evidence, oil waste in area C and chemical waste in area B. But there's three different elements there all fitting together to make a non-conformance. Hope that makes sense and give a bit of sort of like understanding in terms of how you actually grade a non-conformance from the scaling mentioned before, and also what elements are needed in order to actually then provide that evidence. And these non-conformity reports are quite useful because it forces you actually to provide actually not only the requirements, but the findings and the evidence to back this up as well. And this is all from the audit report example that we mentioned before. Perfect. So we'll look at corrective action process now. So the internal audit has raised the findings and said, okay, there's some non-conforming products here. What's the next step? The next step is corrective action. And this is defined as action taken to eliminate the cause of a non-conformity and to prevent reoccurrence. So to keep that in mind, we have that definition, because ultimately what you're looking at here, you're eliminating the cause of the problem, not actually the symptoms. Because what you want to do here is do that root cause analysis, as said above, and prevent the problems from reoccurring in the first place. And you can see here for the example, you need to, in order to retrain your, in order to mistake through the process, you need to retrain your workers, right? And that actually, because the actual correction was to adjust the mistakes, but the corrective action, our root cause, is retraining the workers in some way, shape, or form. And we'll look at an example of that in the next slide. But I do want to draw your attention as well that while we're not looking specifically at root cause analysis and corrective actions in this webinar today, we've actually done a recent webinar of this only about, I think, a month or so ago with one of our field operations managers, Martin Little. That was a fantastic webinar. I really encourage you to check that out if you have a chance. And it's on the recording of that is online, I think on the NQA website and on YouTube. So please check that out because it's a wonderful way to just have a better understanding of that entire topic. Perfect. So corrective action. So you can see here, this is a corrective action example, and this follows that trend from before. And what is to go back to the previous example here, not all waste is held as stored as clearly identified. So that's the issue there. And what's happened here, they've agreed to identify all the waste that's required and review the waste labeling system to establish the reason for errors and menace required. So two elements there: identify the waste required, address the immediate problem, and review basically the system, the process, and understand why this actually happened in the first place. So that root cause analysis there, really plain to see. And what they've done here, they provide an end date for the end of August and the follow date for the end of September. So they have a month or so to make these changes. And what do? They make the changes. So in this particular case, you can look at that first line there. Barcode labeling now introduced and the procedure amended to reflect new system. So within a month, they've introduced a new bit of technology, the barcode labeling, to make sure it's like automated to an extent, so remove perhaps that manual element that may be an issue there. And also they've updated the procedure, which is fantastic. So they've made a tangible change to that process. The value of the internal auditing is seen there. They've raised an issue, they've tried to fix it, and they've provided a new way to do that. So that's one, technology and amend the process. That's number one. If you're looking at the second thing they do, operators have been given a toolbox talk on the need for and regulatory requirements related to waste and the importance of storing correctly and clearly identifying as such. Now, this is fantastic. So what's happened here, they've talked to the operators, the people doing the actual process, and they've actually given them a bit of training and not only did they understand the how to do this in the new process, but most importantly, looking at the why behind that. And so they understand actually why they need to do this. Because as you may already know from terms of when you understand learning a new thing, if you don't understand the why you're doing it, that can be quite problematic because you're just questioning this is relevant. But by emphasizing the regulatory element as well, they're saying that if you don't do this, there will be this risk. And that's the consequence of that. But if you do this, there won't be that risk anymore. All that risk will be minimized, as found out. So that training on the regulatory requirements is essential for that compliance element. And most importantly, they've just taught them the new process. So you can see this. Update process, introduce business technology to automate the elements, training for the staff, and also more training for them to understand the why of that element as well, which will have more because it has more of an impact, not just for that immediate task, but for their understanding of the whole business as a whole. And just to confirm, they've done all this, and the auditors come in and confirm all this, and then checked all the waste and given examples where it's worked out, and gone all waste checked and found okay, and here are 3 examples where they're actually conforming, tick. And they've done the corrective action complete and satisfactory, all done. So do you see how that value of their internal auditing there as well, where a month in, or end of August, the auditors have identified some issues there and things that actually can be improved. And what they've done within a month, they've made 2 or 3 significant changes there as well, and this will put the organization back on the right track and make sure that their management system is working appropriately. But you can see the value that internal audits and internal auditors can bring. Perfect. Right. So I think there was a load of questions that came through there. So I apologize, for example, if I weren't able to answer them at the time, but I will just take the time now to actually answer a couple before we move on to the next couple of slides. Let's go through as well. Hi, I'm not attending alone. As well. James is absolutely fine. You're more than welcome to attend together. That's absolutely fine. Don't worry about that. VUSA, regarding the definition of second-party audits, if a different department within an organization audits under a department in the same organization, is that classed as second-party audits? I would probably need a bit more context about that VUSA as well. I don't think it would be. I think it still would be within the organization as well. I think it's more specific for suppliers, so it would be quite different organizations. But I don't think it would be. But VUSA, I probably need more context about that as well for it to give a better answer to that question. Devi Kroll, so is the question the clause description basically? Devi, I need a bit more context for that question, so apologies for that. If you provide more information about that, just put that into the chat. Mandy, for the purpose of 45,001 certification, how many completed internal audits would be expected each year? Well, that would depend on the severity of the risk, and also generally speaking as well. Generally speaking, usually in most cases, once a year should be sufficient. But I don't know your organization and the risk levels as well, and some requirements might be more or less than that. But once a year should be sufficient. 1911 does not normally, from Ian, ISO 1911 does not normally require major minor grades, and NC do believe it's better to grade them within internal audits. That's absolutely right, Ian, and I'm not going to test that as well. I think what it does, it just provides a bit more context in terms of how urgent or important specific conformities are, because some conformities are you need to get to the sticks very quickly, and some perhaps a bit more can take a bit more time or need a bit more time as well. So it just helps provide more context for this on the grading of the non-conformity. But I agree with you that 1911 does not require from the major or minors. VUSA as well, the definition of a corrective action you presented seems to also include preventative actions. Does that mean you don't need to separate corrective actions? Prevent actions are as two separate items. VUSA, I think I will probably need to get more context on that as well, but I'm happy to follow that up with the email to give you more of the answer, and because I want to make sure I'm completely accurate on that. Andrew, I know you're on the question next, and I apologize for that, but we're just going to continue the rest of the webinar, and I'll make sure I answer your question in the next break, if that's okay. But don't worry, Anthony and Slamat as well, and the other individuals, we will keep going through those questions at the next section. Perfect. So we'll now continue now with the actual internal auditing, but actually what benefits can they bring? We've already emphasized some of the benefits before, and you've seen them from our audit examples, but we just want to go through some of the benefits you can bring as for robust, comprehensive internal auditing. But most importantly, as you can probably imagine, it is a health check, and it's effective means essentially of making sure that you do a robust job on your organization, and if done correctly, then an objective, evidence-based review of your organization's adherence to the ISO standard and all compliance obligations. And speaking of which, by ensuring that you're adhering to the compliance regulations, to the ISO standard, to any legal requirements as well, you then reduce the risk of losing that. Because if you're not actually adhering to those and you lose certification for whatever reason, especially the ISO, this could be a significant risk to your organization's risk model and aims. Especially, for example, if you have an agreement with suppliers that they have to have, or you have to have 14,001, for example, in order to supply your products and services. And if you lose that, then you might lose that business for whatever reason, especially during the tendering process, for example. And moreover as well, if you don't meet those compliance obligations and they're raised in the internal audits and nothing's done about it, that may mean sanctions or even fines depending on the actual severity of that as well, which not only are the financial implications of that as well, the significant risk to the reputation, the brand, the prestige of your organization as well. So really important to have that robustly, and most importantly, allow those internal audits to come in, back them with the top management, and make the necessary changes as needed. Continual improvement. Now, internal audits help organizations create that culture of continual improvement. That culture is really important there for just really understanding that it's not just top management, not just individuals, the employees on the floor. It's everyone in the organization working together to improve the system as a whole. Because by reviewing processes, assessing non-conformance, and suggesting improvements, the performance of the management system will improve. And you can see that from the example I provided earlier about how the corrective action process, by giving that training to those employees, it highlights the importance of doing those processes to meet the regulatory requirements, but also they understand the value it brings, and the risk of not doing it. And by understanding that, having that understanding why not only helps that specific process in the moment, but also applies to other organizations, other parts of organizations as well. Because if they're doing another part of that, doing another task or process, another part, the training might help them and go, well, actually, what's the regulatory risk? What's the risk of not doing this as well? What's the opportunity of doing this? So there's a really positive, sort of almost like compounding impact that I can have from that culture on the whole, and that both from top down to top up. So it's really, really beneficial to whatever business organization you work with. Change management. Now, everyone's fun favorite topic. It can be obviously difficult at the best of times, but internal audits allow that positive, productive change to occur, especially when you need to improve process to meet such a compliance organizations. And frankly, by doing this, organizations that go through this process to change, to improve, to update, will always be ahead of organizations that don't for whatever reason. Risk management, we've already discussed it sort of briefly as well, but you need to make sure that there is that internal audits mitigates those risks, or at least identify and mitigate the risks as needed. And effective risk management is essential for any organization of any size, because you're saving money, you're saving resources, you're saving time, and by mitigating these risks, whether it entirely or to a certain extent, will be enormously valuable for any organization. Another thing as well, I think this is important to point out that sometimes organizations, you might have single points of failure. You might have situations where processes are run of individuals, and those individuals, they leave, they can be actually quite detrimental to the organization. Say they leave with knowledge or understanding of a process or whatever, or anything like that. ISO requirements in particular ensure, right, that you value processes over individuals. So you're not just overly reliant on one. You can actually sort of, a process spread the risks spread over multiple or several individuals or on a team. And ISO itself, internal auditing, can identify these single points of failure and go, this is a risk. You need to take steps to identify that, to rectify that as appropriate. And also as well, the benefits of internal audits. Now, internal audits on occasion will usually be completed annually. That's, I think, the question from, I believe, from Mandy, but I could be wrong there, but depending on the risk level. And this is very different to external audits, because external audits can sometimes happen every maybe 2 or even 3 years. So there's an opportunity here as an internal audit where you can provide a much more accurate account of the organization's compliance, both to the standard and other processes, because you will delve perhaps more deeply than an internal audit. Because an external audit may do every 2 or 3 years, but you will go one every year. You'll see things come up. You might see opportunities for improvement come up, but you actually raise them the opportunity of improvement and you get them early rather than let them become, say, non-conformities of any nature. So by doing that and having that regularly, you actually can get ahead and have more value perhaps than an external audit. And then finally as well, I think we discussed this in the previous webinar a couple of months ago, but I think it's really important to understand how valuable that, what you can do in your organization to ensure that you get the most value from these from these internal audits. And this includes training internal auditors to make sure they're competent and understanding of the requirements, and they can actually go back, provide those robust internal audits. You make sure they have the experience and the necessary training, as mentioned before. They're supported by top management, because you don't want to be kind of internal audits and you conduct that and top management look at the results and do nothing with it. You have to make sure that they're back in top management to really find the issues within the management system, and then empower to say, right, this needs to be fixed. This is what you need to go and do, and that actually makes the system more robust and stronger as a result of it. And as mentioned before, that culture of improvement throughout the organization and collaboration with all employees. It can happen on occasion where, especially when interviewing employees, they may be resistant, they may think that someone's marking their own homework or marking their work as well, but it's not from a perception of the perception can be for these individuals that it's meant to be a vindictive exercise, but actually internal auditing is meant to help and support and improve, because they know that you can do so, and telling you these are the steps how you go about doing that. So it's about change the perception as well, and this is where you can have the biggest impact in your organization, either as an internal auditor or being an internal auditee, but knowing that they're there to help and support. So hopefully gives an understanding of what you can do as an organization or as an individual in your organization to bring the most value from internal auditing. Right, so we will just spend a little bit of time for questions, but we will have a Q&A section at the end, but I just want to answer them now. So I think there's a couple came through, just making sure that we do that as well. I'm just looking for some of the questions. Andrew, the difference between minor and major nonconformity, how do you challenge them when it's a matter of opinion? Last thing you want to do is annoy the auditor. That is a real worry. That's a great question, Andrew. I think the good thing about this as well is that in my experience with the auditing process is that challenge is probably the wrong word, but you can always have a conversation with the auditor and say, look, if they raise a nonconformity and you think it's not representative, you can say and usually the auditor will happen, and the good example is that they have an issue or see an issue, they'll raise it at the time, and if you feel perhaps it's not a true reflection of the situation, you can say to him, like, okay, we have evidence that suggests otherwise. Can you look at this? And obviously, you don't want to lead the auditor down to an area that you may have prepared beforehand. But ultimately, as well, you can have a conversation with them and provide evidence of the such, and then you can lead up to them to go, okay, actually, I've seen more evidence. Actually, this paints a little bit of a different picture. So I think, Andrew, just talk to them, make it clear that actually that you're not trying to be argumentative, but you have evidence to show that's the case. Obviously, if you don't have evidence, then then the auditor might be correct. But I think it's important to have that conversation with them and not be so adversarial, but more in terms of like, oh, we're trying to work towards the same thing here. How can I help you, and how can you help me? Perfect. Anthony, hi, great webinar. Thank you, Anthony. A question for you. How should an internal auditor assess the adequacy and effectiveness of risk-based thinking implementation in a process when there is limited quantified data? And how can this be aligned with clause 6.1 of the ISO 9001 standard in a way that beats both auditability and continual improvement expectations? Now, Anthony, that's a wonderful question, and I would rather put my answer in email because I do not want to say the wrong answer in a forum. So, and if you're okay with it, send me an email after the webinar, and I'll give you a proper response to that, so you have that in writing. Hopefully, Anthony, that's okay. Obviously, you can't respond, but if you could respond by the text, that would be very helpful, because that's a very detailed question, and I really want to give you a proper answer. And I'm not sure me talking about it might be the best way to respond to that, but I will guarantee you'll give you an answer by email if that's okay. Slamet, is there a standard lead time for auditors to submit RCCA, especially when there is a major, minor, and non-conformity classification? Where can we find the requirement, or is the determination of lead time at the discretion of each company? Sorry, can you just expand on what RCCA is, so just on the same page here? So if you could just put that into the chat, that I can understand that in more detail. Jordan says, I am muted. That's unfortunate. I hope you can still hear me. Apologies for that if you can't hear me. But Jordan, hopefully everyone can still hear me from that. But if not, I apologize. I think this is Michelle. I think I struggle with onboarding other audit team members. Is it okay for me to be the only one doing audits in my company? I'm also the ISO manager. That should be fine, Michelle, as long as you're not marking your own homework. Essentially, what you don't want to do is that you don't want to be doing the process yourself and then auditing against that. That's the only sort of major red flag from that. But ultimately, if you're sort of separate from all that, and actually you are acting with integrity in that way, then it should be fine. But again, with all these things, you need a little bit more context, but I think that should be okay. Keep going. Can you confirm if, so I'm just reading through some of these things as well. So Vusa, can you confirm the terms conformance and compliance are interchangeable? I tend to use the term compliance when referring to regulation legislation. I tend to use conformance when referring to processes of contractual requirements and ISO standard. Is that the best way to differentiate between the two terms? That is a really good question. I would actually use it in that same way in form, but what will happen is the ISO will have very strict definitions in that as well. So I want to be very clear before I actually give you the answer to that. That aligns with exactly how I think of it as well. But Vusa, what I can do, if you send me an email afterwards as well, I'll check out the actual definitions as per ISO, because they're very good with terms and definitions, and I can get back to you, and then we can be really clear in terms of the language you use, because as you're probably aware, they're very hot on that language, so make sure we're on the same page. Miriam, how many people should participate as internal auditors? That depends on the organization. So there might be just one of you, there might be a whole team. It depends. It depends if you, I know, if you have a small company of say 10 people, one would probably be sufficient. But bigger teams might have more. It just depends on how much you can get through. And usually the internal auditing team will grow depending on the size of the task at hand. So Miriam, it only matters to the size of the organization. Christine, thank you very much for your comments as well. Keep going through some of the questions. Christine, who can be an internal auditor? Is there any requirements or for experience? Yes. So the requirements, these are set out in some of the various different standards, but the most important requirement is that you need to show evidence that you've undergone training to be an internal auditor, and it can be raised as a non-conformity if, for example, if you have a team of internal auditors or an individual who has an internal audit and they conduct internal audits, but they don't have the appropriate experience or training to do so. That can be, so yeah. So one thing that I was going to mention later, and we can discuss it briefly, is that NQA does offer internal auditing training, and that's an example where you go on a 1 or 2 day course, and then you get that lovely certificate at the end showing that you are a certified or accredited internal auditor in that particular standard. Perfect. Just looking for some of the questions as well. Richard Jones, how do you ensure independence of auditors within a small team to avoid conflict of interest and auditing? Any suggestions? That's a really good question, and it's a hard one because what will happen is that you have a small team, and then sometimes there'll be a situation where one member of your team has actually done some work that they can't audit against because they have done so as well. The best thing in that situation, Richard, is to expand the team, even if it's just to ensure someone else in your organization is just upskilled in a way to a certain level, that internal auditor status, so they can audit the work, if you will. So it's not that's the only suggestion I can come up top of my head, but that is a common issue we see, say, for example, for maybe smaller companies that perhaps for whatever reason don't have enough internal auditors to sufficiently do their job. So yeah, you just have to expand that team, even if it's just to conduct internal audits on the other individual's work. Perfect as well. Perfect. Right, there's a couple more questions here coming thick and fast. I'm just going to finish off the remaining part of the slides, and then we'll continue with the rest of the webinar and with the Q&A. But just to conclude as well, just so we're on the same page here, and just to adhere to some of the conversations we were having before, and just remind everyone, NQA provides a variety of different certification training services for a variety of different standards here. That's quality, information resilience, food safety, sustainability, automotive, energy, and all the different topics there on board. So that's for certification and training. So if you're interested, for example, in doing internal audit training yourselves, we actually offer quite a few internal auditing courses here, as you can see. So there's 9, 14, and 27, but we offer internal auditing on a variety of different standards from there as well. And by attending this webinar today, you are all eligible for a 10% discount for these courses. So some of these courses can be up to maybe £600, even £1,000, depending on the length of the days. But ultimately, as a result of this webinar, you are entitled to a 10% discount, which is excellent. So yeah, so that should hopefully suggest some of the questions here, but actually about experience in terms of internal auditing. And just to be clear as well, before we go into the Q&A element, there's also further support here. You can call our number, email if you have any questions, visit us on our different socials and our blogs as well. And also, most importantly, if you do have any questions, we do a monthly e-zine in touch that provides different updates on regulatory updates, trainings coming up, webinars, anything of note as well that will affect you in the world of ISO. So perfect. So we're going to finish off the remaining call, the Q&A. There's 5 minutes left of the webinar now before we end at 3 p.m. So I'll do my best to ask the questions, but for individuals who I haven't answered the question for whatever reason, send me an email and I will try and answer my best to answer those questions as well. I know there were 2 individuals earlier that I'd asked them to send emails to. Please don't forget that, because I do want your questions, I do want responses, and please send over those as well. So I'll do my best to answer the questions because there are quite a few that have come through of last 15 or 20 minutes. perfect as well. How do we claim the 10% discount? Oh yeah, but so what will happen as well is that everyone will receive an email with the actual recording and actually as well, and the 10% discount will be in that email as well. So so you're more than welcome to see that that you use that discount when you want to when that email comes through. The email should come through in the next day or so, so you'll have that email very soon, hopefully. Jenny, do you offer an integrated course model? My company is integrating 9014-45. We do offer an integrated model as well. It's fantastic. So we do that. We do training in that as well, and most importantly, we do internal auditor training on that. So if you're interested in undertaking that, please let us know, and we'll be more than happy to send over the dates. Jenny, if you want to submit your questions, I would recommend you could either respond to the email that you'll get the next day or the webinar, or what you can do, you can use send the info@nqa.com, or alternatively, if you want to direct with me, you can type in all training at nqa.com. So that's training, all lowercase, at nqa.com, and that should be over there. And actually, what I'll do, I'll actually put in the I'll actually respond to that in the chat, so everyone has that for reference. Send to all. Perfect. There you go. So you're training at nqa.com. Yuli, if you want the presentation material, they'll be sent afterwards as well, but that with the recording, so you have that for reference. This is quite a few questions, so I apologize I'm not answering them as quickly as I should. So just going through up as well. James Alexander, I have completed the lead auditor course for third-party auditing. Does this also qualify me for internal audits? It does, which is very good. So, which is quite nice about doing those lead auditor or lead auditor conversion courses. It qualifies you both internal and external auditing for that particular standard, which is excellent. So 2 birds, 1 stone, if you will. Cindy, how often should a lead auditor recertify their certification? So all standards will have a date at the end of their standard. So for example, 9001 will have a date of 2015. So that's the 2015 version of that standard. If long as you lead auditor course to that version and not an earlier version, for example, then that will be fine for the moment. But at some point, 9001 in particular will be updated. Now, we don't know when that will be. It might be 2026, might be 2027, but whenever it is, when that is, everyone will have to be recertified or recertified to that new version standard, because there'll be new things in it that actually you need to demonstrate that you understand how to audit against, or understand how to explain and talk about in detail. So that's where you will need to do that. But for the moment, as long as you are certified or lead auditor or internal auditor to that date, you can audit against that standard as appropriate. So that's perfect. We're down to 1.5 minutes. So I must apologize for not being able to answer questions. They're coming through thick and fast, so I apologize. Andrew Turley, I have been doing internal audits for 10+ years, but have no formal training. Am I a non-conformance? Well, Andrew, I wouldn't call yourself a non-conformance, but that can be raised depending on the circumstances, where as a non-conformance, because you have to show that you have sufficient evidence or competence that you have. That you can do internal audits. Now, I will need to see your experience, and the auditor will need to assess your experience and whether that is sufficient for the requirements. But that could be a non-conformance, even though you have 10 years. But it could at least not be if you have, say, one as well. So hopefully that answers your question, and we'll take it from there. But I apologize. There are some questions come through. Like Amanda, I can see your question on how specific should audit points be, but we are actually running out of time, and I sincerely apologize. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for everyone for all your help today, especially for all the questions that come through. Please send me emails via the training@nqa.com for any questions you may have, and I will be more than happy to answer the questions. I'm not trying to duck, we're just running out of time, but seriously, use 10% discount, check out our internal auditing courses at NQA Training, and I sincerely hope all of you today have a wonderful rest of the week. And questions, send it away, and yeah, but let me know if any questions, and I'll speak to you all very, very soon. Thank you very much for your time today. Take care. Bye-bye.